Welcome back to Finding the Edge podcast. I'm Garrett Boyum, joined with Cal Dupick.
So, a tweet I had a little while ago sparked your interest. We started talking about dexterity, stability, metastability. Why don't you read it and let's start from there.
Sure. The thing that you tweeted out back in August was many of our systems preparing athletes for the performance context create stability, but at the expense of flexibility. From an ecological framework, we are interested in metastability, the ability to hold that tension between stability and flexibility of movement solutions. I think really what kind of touched this off even more was the comment there is, does metastability require a baseline of stability before flexibility becomes meaningful? And I think that is a question that a lot of people have. And I think that's why today we kind of wanted to explore, what is stability and what is metastability, and what are the fundamentals, because I think that's kind of the question that everybody has is, all right, do we have to develop the fundamentals first?
Let's begin. Analyzing. Finding the edge.
The fundamentals are the building blocks on which we build everything else. But I think I want to kind of even go back to understanding when we're talking about stability, what are the fundamentals to that? And so I think the place to start is with what are attractors, an attractor landscape? And even too, just thinking about the motor landscape. Because for me, when I start conceptualizing things in this way, it changes how I understand what is it that we're trying to do when we are trying to acquire or learn the fundamentals. And so within an ecological approach, for me, I feel like the big shift was going from thinking about there's this one right way, or this one way, or these right ways that I need to learn how to do things. And then from there, then I can branch out. But rather, to me now, the way that I understand it, thinking about it from the space of a motor landscape, I begin to think about it more as, a map, right? I really want to become very well acquainted with a certain section of the map. That can become kind of my basics, or understanding how to navigate the map or read the map or all this sort of stuff. One way to think of it is whenever I started, for all of us who went to public school, right? When you first get to a new school, right? You start, junior high, you start high school. What do? You really only focus on how to get to your classes. That's it.
Yep.
But after a little while, you start to explore more. And actually what I found is the best way to get to know a building is to try to get lost in the building. That's how you begin to actually learn how to navigate the building and to be able to get to any place of the building whenever you want, or, one hallway is all jammed up with people, how do I still get to where I need to go? Understanding the shortcuts and the ways around all that, right? So to me, when we first start out with anything, and this kind of goes back to the constraint-led approach, I think there is a misconception of we just want people to figure it out. Number one. Number two, we're just going to tell them to explore right out the gate.
Mm-hmm.
And oftentimes, right, if I were to just straight up ask you right now, hey, tell me a story.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Most people would freeze. They wouldn't know. I'll use a different example off of that my friend did when he was doing political campaigning, and he was going to get signatures and all that sort of stuff. So he ended up eating at Subway a lot, to the point where he just absolutely couldn't stand it anymore. But yet that was the only place he could eat. So he finally was like, you know what? I need to mix it up. I'm just going to ask the person who's making the sandwiches to make me a sandwich, anything you want. And just how often people froze at you can make any sandwich you want. Then they start to ask questions. Well, do you want this or this? And, so anyways, the point is when it comes to when you give people all this freedom to pick anything, oftentimes they freeze. And so going back to this idea and this concept of constrain to afford, it's the same thing of like, telling a story or writing a story or whatever it is, right? Unless you get a good prompt, which constrains the number of options, that helps people actually begin to explore. And that's where you really see the creativity come out. And so in the same way, when we're starting to talk about like acquiring the fundamentals, right? We need to give them a constraint to narrow their search to a specific area, and then give them maybe a specific goal or whatever it is. And then from there, you begin to have them explore around that to get to better understand the landscape, instead of just trying to like just do the same thing over and over again, or like this is how you have to do it. And so to me, that's where I want to kind of change or introduce a different way of thinking about like what are fundamentals.
Yeah, I think, having just moved, I've experienced this. I was driving around the new town, realizing like, wow, I really don't know where I'm going, right? Like if I get off on a different road or there's too much traffic or I miss my turn. And I think in that way, that's where it can be so beneficial there's probably a better way to say it, but just learning the basics or having an initial spot where somebody can explore is really important. And it's actually probably something that we've shifted for our guys this fall, is that we sort of defined that the first 4 weeks of the fall would be a lot more of, taking from the post framework, like just the general global intention would be more stability based. Hey, what are the things that we think are really important? The things that we want you to have a good base of, say in the arm care, like what's the way that this platform says you should do it, so that then eventually we can start to sort of break the rules around that general area. Or if a guy's learning a new pitch, something like that, again, narrow their search so they can focus a little bit more. Even your example there makes me think of like when I asked my kids after school, how was your day? Oh, it was good. What was good about it? And I actually have to get like more and more narrow before they share anything meaningful with me. And then it actually starts to explode, because that connects to this and this connects to that. And I think that there's something going on there in terms of like narrowing the search, being more specific initially. And I wonder if that's where I always want to be careful not to give the devil his due, if that's maybe the wrong phrase, but like I think that's maybe where some people struggle with the ecological view. It's like, oh, you don't think that at all. It's like, no, that's not it. It's just we don't want to stay there. And that feels like what sometimes the traditional old style coaching does, is it just essentially, oh, you find this solution and you just stay there. You stay in sort of this stable region, and then that stable region becomes such a, to your point, deep attractor state that you can't move out of it. And we actually, in making somebody good at something, we actually made them worse because they can't move out of it, so to speak.
Yeah. And so I think I kind of want to contrast this and go back to like, okay, the traditional view, right? Of what is it that we're trying to do for stability wise, and the foundation that we're trying to build on is like giving them a place to start to have success, right? Like you can maybe talk about like swing path or whatever it is, right? What you would consider something like fundamental, but to me, when you're first starting out, and I think ecological dynamics, again, especially ecological psychology, first with really, in my opinion, Eleanor Gibson, but I do think too with J.J. Gibson, but like with Eleanor Gibson, like looking at child development. I think same thing with Carl Newell. They were looking at how do babies develop and acquire skill. Okay. And if you start to think about it, like for both of us, we've had, we're recent parents-ish, more or less. And what you notice, and what I've noticed with my kids, like approaching it from an ecological perspective, they just randomly will move their arms around. But like from an ecological perspective, it's always about the organism environment relationship, right? Mm-hmm. And that there's information constantly being exchanged there. Okay. So as the baby is moving around, they're beginning to get information about their environment. And then if they can start to develop a relationship between something, meaning like, okay, they hit something and then it moves, right? It reacts to something that they do. All of a sudden now they're learning more about the environment. The other things you'll see, like young kids do, they put everything in their mouth, right? So there's a level of like learning about the environment, like what is eatable, right? And like all these sort of things of like, how are the different ways that you can interact with the environment? And so when it comes to like did you ever like teach a kid how they're supposed to walk? You know what I mean? Hey, you need to grab the ground with your toes and create an arch, and like, hey, fix your anterior pelvic tilt. Like you need to walk with a stacked, you need to ribs down and like stack canister. Like it's not how we don't teach babies how to move like that, And so to me, that's where, the argument that, well, we have to teach them the techniques. It's like, not necessarily. That's not how children do it. But if you go to I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit, but I do want to go now kind of transition here to, okay, let's say we are trying to drill something in, right? Like the swing path or whatever it is. You want some sort of move, your load, whatever, how your arm slots, whatever it is that you want to focus on. Okay. So I want to start talking about attractor states, right? So if we go back to this slide here on the far right, okay, we have what's like an attractor landscape and how skill kind of develops over time. So if you think of it, what this looks like for people who are just listening, right? You just think of like a still pond, or like actually being a Minnesotan, right? You go out, fresh snow, it's completely just pristine and flat, okay? As you begin to interact with that clean environment, you begin to change the landscape, right? Now you start to create a path. And the more you walk that path, the deeper the path goes, okay? So when you are trying to repeat a technique, repeat a way of doing things, you're digging a groove, right? And so these are all, I'm not saying anything like crazy here, right? We all understand like, oh yeah, I'm trying to groove a swing. I'm trying to create muscle memory, all that sort of stuff. And so from a dynamic systems theory point of view, what you're trying to do is what is happening is you're creating an attractor well, right? And over time, the more that you do that thing over and over again, the deeper that attractor well becomes. And then as you get into that motor landscape, as you get closer to that context in which you created that attractor state, it kind of has its own gravitational pull, so to speak, right? You could think of it as like a ball and elevation, right? So as you get closer, it's going to start rolling. It's going to start rolling to the bottom of that attractor well. And so so this is why, for example, right, you want to change the way somebody's done, like swung the bat or thrown a ball for their whole life. And why it's so resistant to change, right, is because as soon as it gets close at all to something that reminds the body of like, this is how we do this, it's going to default to that, right? And so that
also doesn't also underscore, as you say, that it just makes me think how it underscores what you've alluded to, the performer environment relationship, and how our tendency to try to get somebody out of an attractor state is actually just sort of a divorce them from the environment and why that skill would emerge at all. And so it also makes sense why it's so hard if we're just like, no, you got to drill this certain arm path or bat path or slot. But if it's divorced from the context that thing emerged, I'm not even sure.
It's not going to transfer. It's not going to
transfer. That's the point. Yeah.
It's not going to show up where you want it to show up, right?
Correct.
And so this is where, like, if you think about it from a landscape standpoint, okay? So if you take them out of the landscape that they're in, okay, and you go drill in a new landscape, well, then when you come back to the old landscape again, you're still going to fall back into that because you never changed. You never changed the landscape that you're actually working in.
Rob Gray has the chapter in his first book, How We Learn to Move, because I loved him, but the Tim Tebow problem. That's a perfect example of this.
Do you want to build that out? Like, what's the Tim Tebow problem?
So he had a really long arm swing on his football throw, right? He went down with the ball instead of most quarterbacks being a little bit shorter. And so that gave just this fraction of a second that when we went from the college game to the NFL,
where everything's faster,
like that solution wasn't effective anymore. And I remember him working with Tom House and like doing thousands of reps and like watching practices, and he would do the perfect, like in and out, right to his ear, then he'd go to the game and it'd come right back, because it isn't about training in the, repetition over and over, and then muscle memory. And now I have it, and now I'll just transfer it to the environment that I wasn't doing it in, and it just magically appears. So that was a very good visual for me as somebody who watched a lot of Tim Tebow football in the NFL. Be like, that makes sense, right? It makes sense why he continue to have that gravitational pull towards that attractor well, that stable state that he had for years.
I mean, it just makes me think of when I was studying about learning and memory, the best people who are best at remembering things, right? They build what's called a mind palace. Right. And so the idea is that you tie it to a certain thought, feeling, state, place that you know well. And memories are tied to some sort of context. Right. And so the same thing is true when we're talking about movement. Yeah. I mean, this goes into other things too, of embodied cognition, right? Our memories are not just in our brain. They're actually, this is weird because I've been, and several other people, who are EcoD adjacent are there's no such thing as muscle memory. And now I'm actually starting to rethink that because of this idea and this notion of embodied cognition. I mean, we're seeing with transplants, right, of tissues, whether it's bone, heart, lung, kidney, etc., right? People's preferences transfer, the host, preferences, things that they like to do, that person who receives the tissue then all of a sudden starts to have the same predilections and the likes that the donor had. And so now we're to me, there is something to be said of okay, the memory is actually stored in the behavior within the tissues themselves. And so with that being said though, okay, so now we're talking about okay, the motor landscape and understanding how, in order to actually change that, right? If we want to do construction, right? If we want to change the road and how the road works, you have to do construction where the road is. And so understanding that, okay, maybe now let's get practical here. Okay. So maybe I can't always get it exactly the same, right? Because it's a game context, like Tim Tebow, right? But what if I can get us close to the outskirts of where the attractor well starts and start to make changes there? And then hope to start to blend it out. Because here's going back to these attractor states, which you can see here, how deep and narrow, because this is when we start talking about attractor states, how narrow the well is will tell you how many different situations it's going to be useful for. Okay, so the narrower it is, the smaller window that it has to work, or the bandwidth that it has to different ways that it's going to work. And so sometimes it makes sense to widen an attractor well so that it can cover more situations or more solutions. Okay. And so that can be one way. And then you talked about with Tebow, it not being functional, right? If he is an adaptive person and he is going to adapt, if you change the constraints a little bit and allow him to explore, he may now find a new functional solution within the game. Now, there's other reasons why that wouldn't necessarily happen, because maybe his focus isn't on that. It's more just we're in the moment, we're just reacting, and we're just going to default back to what we've always done in that case.
Well, it makes me think with the Tebow example, it sort of makes sense why so many people kind of believed in this traditional idea of muscle memory living more in the brain, as opposed to what you were talking about with embodied cognition, that it's well, if it's not going away, aren't you just saying that once that solution's not effective anymore in the NFL? Wouldn't he just change because he's now embedded in this environment where it's not effective? It's well, not necessarily. That's kind of the point with, if you've created such a narrow, stable state that isn't functional, that
only covers a small, only functional in a small,
in a certain,
certain situations and contexts.
Yeah. Years of experiences and activities, just years of complexity that we don't even really know about, that athlete is coming from, that honestly, just quite frankly, really challenges us to have to do a lot more search and exploration with them, as opposed to, oh no, here's the right answer. And so I understand why somebody would, when I think about that, would go, well, why wouldn't we just rep it? But that's kind of the problem.
Because here's my other reason for why not rep it. and try to build these attractor states early, because you don't know if they're going to be functional at the next level. You just don't I mean,
important.
you can assume, but like, okay, great. Maybe even to like, it's a pro athlete, that's advising a younger athlete, right? And it worked for them, but that does not necessarily mean that it's going to work for the next person. Right. And so like, that's to me the thing of like, I mean, you can say or whatever. Okay, cool. But I mean, it's not your career. And how many people did it not work for? You're probably not remembering those people.
Think about if you go to any youth activity, youth sport. This is why skill acquisition specialists, people with an ecological framework and understanding, it's why we're so important, because we're trying to understand how skill emerges in the performer environment relationship. And why is that so important? Because you're going to go to some youth activities, and I start to see this now, and I go, I actually don't know if that rule, which does help the game function better, is useful. You know what I mean? Because it might be digging a sort of attractor state, a stable state that like won't be present when they play at the next level. You know what I mean? So like, for instance, I was watching my daughter's softball game, and just like the stable state of throwing it back to the pitcher before base runners now can't go anymore if it gets back to the pitcher. And so you start to see.
So this was a practice. This was a practice activity.
No, this is a game. This is a game, right? And so in Little League, you saw.
Oh, this is a game rules within the
and
the
actually
game for
you'll see,
your age group.
Yeah, and you'll see this at a lot of, I think it's especially 3rd and 4th grade, maybe like your 8, 10, 12U, where like if you get the ball back to the pitcher, it's almost like when we used to play growing up.
Like in
just get it back to the pitcher, and you're not halfway, you can't go. And it's like, well, that was a pretty good rule when we were just doing it on the playground. And like we had fewer players, and we were constraining the game based on.
And you didn't have like an umpire and like different.
We didn't have an umpire, exactly. But what I'm noticing is is now the girls are no longer connected to the problem to be solved. Where's the base runner at? Why would I throw it to a certain place? They're just like, hey, and everybody and all the parents and coaches, I don't blame them, because it's just like, it makes sense.
What the rule incentivizes.
Yeah. Yes. They'll go, yeah, get it back to the pitcher. Because what are they saying? Well, then you can't do anything. Like, then we won't lose. Then the girl won't go. But it's like, I'm not sure that that's what we want. And then they go to the next level. That's not a functional solution anymore, because that rule's gone. And I'm not saying it's a bad rule. We shouldn't do that. But I do think for me, what it highlights is this idea that like, once something starts to become stable, like I think you should be really afraid about staying there, because now that these girls know that that's the best solution, it's like, you might want to get away from that, because if it becomes too stable, then it's going to take longer. We're not preparing them for the next level. We're not preparing them to understand why they might do things in certain situations. And so it's almost like, and that's how I've often treated it with our guys. Like, if I start to see something, functional and stable, I'm going to embed it more in the real thing right away, or I'm going to try to like help them vary it, explore around it, so that it becomes more dynamic and what we alluded to earlier, these metastable regions where we're moving from different attractor states instead of just staying in one spot. But I think that's why we're so important as skill acquisition people, just trying to understand this world, is because everything we do as learning environment designers are going to either feed into one stable state or help them move between them.
Yeah. And I do want to kind of clarify, like, you're speaking specifically about practice, right? Mm-hmm. And when you want to start to change things up in practice. I do want to kind of now flip it to the opposite end, because I think what I think is important, and why to have this conversation about attractors, is like now to better understand what it is that we're looking at. And maybe we'll get to it. We haven't really dove into like multi-stability here, or metastability.
Well, let me ask this question to you, because I think this is something that I always think when I see these charts, and and whether you're just listening along with us, and you just have these deeper ridges, right, that are more stable solutions for people. How does one, if you're listening to this, how would you better help somebody understand how deep a stable state is? Because visually this totally makes sense, but then you get in the messiness of like watching a player play a very dynamic, complex game, and you're starting to wonder, well, how do I see this in the dynamic, like how stable are certain solutions, and are they too stable and they're not going to be able to get out of them? How would you kind of help somebody figure out that piece of it?
So I want to go back a slide and start to look at like the attractor landscape. Okay. So where I'm going with this is that, okay, with these attractors, there's not just one attractor within an individual. There's multiple ones, and these things are layered together. And so if I start messing with, say, for example, like I'm looking at a hitter, okay, and he's got like a really compact swing that's really handsy, and it's really short. And then also, you look at his base and it's maybe kind of wide and he's kind of upright. Mm-hmm. Okay. So like, which thing do you start playing with there? Because they're all attractor states. Each component of that is an attractor state. And then how he swings the bat, right, and interacts with the pitches. There's multiple things that are going on there, because again, when we start talking about attractor states, we're not just talking about like how the body moves, right? This extends to the performance environment. This extends to the person's cognitive degrees of freedom, where their focus is, where their attention is, how they think.
Perception.
All of
Perception,
it, right?
Cognition, exactly.
And so this thing is so layered that you have to understand
Can we give a couple examples? Because I know initially for me, it was hard. Like, it was easy to understand how somebody's like action degrees of freedom might be super stable. Like, oh, they swing the same way every single time. Right. And but I think sometimes when you're thinking about like, well, what might be like a super stable, not beneficial, they can't move out of it, perceptual or cognitive
negative self-talk
state.
Negative self-talk, yes, right? I think that's a big one. How you talk, how you perceive or reflect, interpret what just happened. Right. You see all of these things. Those are attractor states. Basically, what's their default? It doesn't mean they always, right? For sure. But it means predominantly when an event happens, right, they tend towards a certain behavior, and or response.
Likes to hit the same receiver, which can be very beneficial when that guy's really good and they need it. But also there can be a cost benefit analysis there. There can be cost to that if somebody else is open and they're so locked in perceptually to that person on every play, instead of, skilled intentionality, being open to a wide landscape of affordances as opposed to just one. So that would be like maybe a perceptual one. I
mean, we'll get there of like why metastability is really an important concept to understand, and which leads into what is dexterity. But what I want to do first before we get there is I want to flip this, okay? Because what happens if their attractor state is very functional? Okay, so right, you've heard this, right? So many guys are constantly always trying to improve what they're doing, and then all of a sudden they go from being really good to like struggling, right? And so there is, something to be said to a lot of, that coaches have said is like, look, if it's not broken, like, why are we going to go fix it? Like, if this is what got you here, like, you need to maintain this strength. You still need to, like, if it got you to the dance, like, stick with it. And so this is the challenge that we're working with here is like, okay, I've heard plenty of people be like, oh, that's not going to work at the next level. Mm-hmm. But it's actually like, but if you start going and messing with it because you think it's not going to work at the next level, you might make him worse and he won't get to the next level. Right. So like there's this balance that we need to work here of like, not all attractor states are bad, and so like, this is the thing of like, there's two different scenarios.
I think this is important. I think it's important to acknowledge what you just said there, right? Like that our head coach is fond of saying, I love it when he says this, you don't have to have a problem to find a better solution. But I do think people in the baseball world, because we sometimes live in all the MLB data, a 162 game sample size. It's like, well, this is what makes him really good over the long haul. Why would you go away from that? And we want to acknowledge it. I think that's really important to drill down and acknowledge what you said. And I know a lot of people can be, this is what this guy's good at, so we should just keep doubling down on it. Yeah, for sure. But also somebody's going to exploit that and something's going to change. And I just think it's important to highlight that piece, because sometimes what we'll do is we'll take like, I don't know, Aroldis Chapman or Craig Kimbrell or name somebody who's just like this elite performer, and they have just off the charts characteristics that lots of other players don't. And we go, well, they've stayed the same the whole time. And I'm like, I'm not actually sure they have. I actually think they've changed and they've learned to adapt to continue to produce that same outcome, in new and unique ways. But I just think it's important to acknowledge what you said there, that a lot of people are really nervous about, you don't want to make them worse. But I do think part of that is because we often train people to only be good at one thing. And so then when we try to help them learn to have more functional, more adaptive solutions, well, of course, they've never trained that way. So it's probably not going to look very good right away. I think that's actually might speak more towards what they're struggling with, or excuse me, the environments that they've been embedded with. If they struggle they're going to lose their skill because they're trying to become more adaptive, then it shows how fragile that skill actually was,
Yeah, I think there's an element of that. I think other reasons why that happens is because their focus of attention shifts. There's lots of things that happen when you start to make changes. But going to one thing that you said, there's the contrast of what you mentioned, the focus on adaptability in terms of what it is that you're trying to do with your practice and your development and just your global intention versus my intention is to maintain, my swing. It needs to be a certain way. It needs to move a certain way, that sort of a thing. And trying to, perfect your reps. And I think that's where the contrast is on, because here's this other thing is like I hear a lot of people say this, even when we talk about something like EcoD, sometimes people will say this as well from that side of the aisle a little bit. They're not like hardcore EcoD people when they're saying this though. So I'm not saying that, like somebody like Sean or, Tyler or somebody would say this or Rob or whatever. But some people will be like, I train for the perfect outcome. And same thing, like, I always practice my A swing, because then then my B swing will just, be there, I don't practice falling, and tripping or like whatever, and it's like, well, it depends. Like how often is that part of your environment and like what stage of your career are you in? Because that's the other thing is we have to also remember like the stages of careers. And that also loops me back to what I was trying to say before is like, there's two different scenarios here. There's the brand new beginner. Right. And then there's the elite skilled person who's been doing it for years. For sure. These principles apply to both, but where you're starting is different. Right. So with the new athlete, right, a beginner, okay, they don't have like a ton of attractors set yet. They're very malleable. And if we go back to like the landscape, it's pretty flat. And when you have things that are pretty flat and like with low attractor wells that are pretty shallow and maybe wide, is there's not a lot of stability there and there's not also a lot of functionality. Okay. And so with that, we have to understand that, okay, because these deep attractor wells are happening for one of two reasons. Okay. They can still be non-functional. Okay, and start to show up because you start doing the same thing over and over again as you play. I'll use an example. I used to play Civilization all the time, and I would always play it the same way. Mm-hmm. Okay, I always I had an aversion to risk and taking a lot of risks. Right. For sure. So then, that is an attractor well that developed for my play style. Right. And so that was maybe functional in very narrow circumstances or whatever, right? And so like you can develop some very non-functional attractor wells because of a certain play style or an intention or whatever, a focus, whatever it is, right? Yeah. And so these things accrue over time. The more times you go down the path, right? So like let's just use the example of walking through the woods, right? The more you walk through a path, the more the brush and all that sort of stuff starts to dissipate in that area. Actually, let's just use this, the mound, right? Or your cage, right? The more guys swing on it, the more there's a hole that starts to wear in there, right? So that doesn't mean that it's necessarily functional. It's just, this is where everybody is constantly going through there, right? Yeah. So the question becomes, all right, is how do I develop functional movement, regardless of whether I am at the beginner stage or at the higher level stage, right? And so what the ecological approach is going to say is that we learn through our exploration of the environment, We begin to know the environment better. We want to become more in touch, more in tune with our environment and how we interact with the environment. Okay. And so this is how, for me, this has changed how I begin to think about things. Okay. So I gave the example earlier about like, okay, if I really want to learn a new space, I kind of got to get lost in it. Okay. So part of developing the fundamentals is picking a space to explore. And we want to provide as much information, rich information for them to interact with. And they don't need to interact with all of it all at once at the beginning. It just needs to be there present. And this is where this whole notion of repetition, okay, comes in of like, there's a quote from a pastor that I heard that I thought was really, really interesting. Repetition is the soil in which spontaneity is birthed. Now, I think what's interesting there is because a lot of times a lot of people in the EcoD space have talked about like, you need to explore, you need to do novel things. It needs to be rep without rep. And yeah, for sure, rep without rep. But there's something because of the tradition that this person's coming from. They were talking about like having a prayer rule. You say the same prayers over and over again. You're like, man, that doesn't feel very ecological. But if you start to think about it for a second, every time you show up to pray, you're in a different state. You're never the same. You never can step into the same river twice, but there's a consistency of what you're coming back to, right? So let's flip this to this example of training, and maybe we can pick, you can throw out a specific skill or space that we want to explore, but let's just keep going with an abstract example here. So I'm going back, now we flip it. So now I've picked a space that I want to explore, okay? But I keep coming back to the same space. That's the repetition piece. But each time I come to that space, I'm different. Each time I come to that space, I may shift my intention. Each time I come to that same space, I may be trying to explore. Let's use this as an example. Like I want to learn how to skateboard, right? So I keep coming back to kind of the same park, and I'm exploring the same half pipe. But each time I'm going in the half pipe, I'm trying to do something different. I'm trying to understand the half pipe a little bit better and to understand how my body interacts with the board and all these different things, right? Each time I'm going through, and even if I'm trying to execute the same thing, I'm trying to learn how to slightly do that different. So here's another example. I've been playing around with rope flow. I've been trying to learn that and some different moves. And I've been trying to take, okay, I'm going to start to explore doing different things, and like, yes, I'm going to try, kind of part hole and some other things, but I'm understanding that each time I'm going through this, I'm getting more information. My body is learning more information about how to manipulate the rope. I want to try to start to understand how the rope moves and the feel and all of this sort of stuff. And so to me, that's where the exploration kind of comes in. And then that's also where like this intention piece and like learning how to become fully present in the moment. And there's so many different components of like playing around with this. And so that I think is the kind of the key right there. And it kind of goes back to the episode that we recorded a while back on the power of play, right? This idea of playing with it. When you play with something, you're spinning it, you're turning it, you're meditating on it, you're all these sort of things, and you're beginning to try to understand more. And so to me, this comes back to this, the language too around ecological dynamics, becoming attuned and sensitive to the environment. And so that's kind of how this is different from rote repetition.
For sure. I think that's where like so much of this requires us to seek and explore and understand the nuance of like why something might have worked, but where maybe we got off kilter with it along the way, and how we better understand what was actually giving birth to that thing that quote unquote worked. That idea there, I think of so often exploration is seen as doing wildly different things. And yet we recognize that in our sport, there are only so many ways that you can throw the ball really, really hard or have a really, really high exit velocity. And we know those things are useful. But number one, we want to do those things in context, not divorced from the context. We want those skills of swinging the bat fast and hitting a ball hard, or throwing a ball fast and having really great life on it. We want those to emerge in the actual thing we want. So I think it does allude to what you said at the very beginning, like, and props to Rob Gray for talking about like at least he was the first one who I think wanted to challenge people to rethink that like fundamentals don't necessarily need to be viewed as evil, so to speak, but instead, how do we reframe fundamentals? Because most of the time, what are fundamentals when I go out on a youth field? It's technique, it's mechanics. And a lot of people think, to your question earlier, that what people need is, well, I need to have this technique or this stable thing first, and then I can sort of add on to it. But if I don't have that first fundamental of technique, then I can't do it. And it's like, what we're really saying is like, what's probably fundamental is the performer environment relationship. It is functional solutions. It's the ability to problem solve. And so I think that one of the misconceptions at times is it's not that we're not trying to find stable solutions. We are. It's just we're trying to find stable solutions and be able to keep repeating those within the changing constraints. And so maybe you are a guy who's a huge power hitter. You need to find different ways to do that thing that you're great, instead of just like, well, I only have an A swing, or I only can hit this pitch, right? And I think that can be the challenge with what we're sort of pushing back. If stability becomes more of a technique thing, or more of a, I only have one solution for one situation, it's like, no, can you do it across conditions? I think that's really important. I'm reminded of, I think Ian Renshaw has said, like he likes to have coaches more about deficit detector. He doesn't like, he uses that language, but like more of a strengths finder. But he acknowledges that when you have those deficits, like they can't sink you. So a perfect example right now is Michael Harris, who I think is walking at like a 1%, 2% clip this year. And it's sunk him. Like the dude, if he can just walk at a little higher clip, is like perennially, potentially like an MVP guy. You saw this with Javi Baez early in his career. So we're not saying that Javi Baez or Michael Harris have to start walking at a Juan Soto clip in order to be an effective player. No. They can be who they are, but they can't be so stable in that they can't figure out how to not get sunk by the thing they're weak at. So 100%, if you have something that you're very good at, do it more. For instance, because again, sometimes when I talk about these things, people are like, oh, so you want them to do different things and not double down on what they're good at. I had a young man last year who is a reliever for us. The year before I got there, threw like 61, 62% sliders. He threw like 82% sliders for me. And so I did the thing more that he was good at. Why? Because he was good at it. I was going to double down on it. But what we did do is it was like a sweeping slider. And so we worked most of the year on creating a breaking ball that had depth, because he threw so many breaking balls, and ended up finding that just a knuck on his slider, he could throw it the same way, get depth. And we threw it multiple times during the year. And most of the time it wasn't anywhere near the zone, but we'd follow it up and he'd immediately create a whiff, because he'd be throwing. So sometimes this idea of adaptability, to me, it's almost twofold, and maybe there's a connection there of how they're connected, but it's almost twofold.
Yeah, we'll get there.
Getting me back to the thing I'm strong at, right? Like, but then also not letting somebody else exploit that, if you know what I mean. Right.
And so kind of where I want to go to build off of what you're saying there is that sometimes our strengths can turn into weaknesses. And so and here's a good example that I think all the analytics people can understand here is when we do like traditional machine learning, right? Like if we feed too many inputs or whatever, right? We can overfit to the data. Okay. And then we're no longer actually, the data that we're getting back is no longer functional, right? And so like it's the same thing can happen as we lose the forest through the trees, so to speak. When we double down on our strength to all else, we begin to lose our flexibility. And the attractor state becomes so stable that it only works in a small window. Because here's the other thing, right? Is you have a resisting opponent, right? Yes. In the game, your opponent or the person on the other side, if they're a worthy opponent or good at all, right? They're going to be trying to figure out how to counter your strength.
Yeah.
And so you have to have some level of flexibility to allow. So like here's another example, and I think I've used this other times on the podcast, right? I think about Ronda Rousey, right? She was an elite, was that judo, at grappling and like submitting people. She was extremely elite at that. Where she went wrong was she wanted to be just as elite at standing up and fighting on her feet. And I think there's nothing wrong with that, but in the short window, right? Like everybody else who like their strength, like she was elite at judo because she'd been doing it for years and years and years and years, right? And so really all she needed to do was just shore up her stand-up game to give herself enough time to utilize her strength. That to me is the same thing of like what we're talking about here is like, say, for example, your guy who threw a ton of sliders. That's great. But he still needs to be able to throw a fastball for a strike when he needs it. Because
would it be accurate to say for that guy, because again, I want to highlight this because I think this is what you're saying. Tell me if you agree. We're not saying throw less sliders, do the thing that you're good at less. That's not what we're saying. I think people hear that and go, oh, so you throw 81. No, you should throw like 50 and balance it out. No, we're not saying that. I just told you I upped it by 20. What we're saying is you need to be able to throw that slider across situations and conditions. You need to be able to throw it to righties, to lefties. You need to throw it when you're ahead in the count, behind the count. You need to throw when you're super fatigued or fresh, or when the umpire's not giving you the edge of the zone, or when it's moving a little bit too much that day and you need to tighten it up, or when the wind's blowing in your face and that's affecting the movement profile. We're just simply saying across situations and conditions. You can double down on your strength, but not in only one situation. And that seems to be the problem.
But then what do you also do when your opponent adapts? Because this is what I saw when I was at Missouri State. We had a kid, a JUCO guy, come in and he had a banger slider. Threw that thing a ton. But by year 2, it started to not be quite as effective. In year 3, it was way less effective. No, it was like super, like he still did fine, but his numbers weren't quite as elite anymore. And it's because everybody knew that they were going to see sliders. So they just sat on it, right? So like, this is why I'm saying you need to have other tools. You need to bring up your secondary or your weakness or whatever so that you can, to go back to the MMA example, you need, like, let's say you're great at stand-up. Your weakness is the game. So you need to be able to defend and counter the ground game so that you can stay standing up, or that you can get from the ground back to standing up to fight where you're strongest. And so the same thing is true whether it's pitching or hitting. Is like, let's use Javi Baez or as the example of like, you need to walk enough so that you can get more pitches that you can swing at, because your ability to because I actually saw a video saying because Javi worked too much at like trying to be the exact opposite and walk a ton, he was striking like he was also becoming worse. And so him opening up and becoming more of a free swinger was kind of what he needed to get back to. And I think that's what he did. And then now he's struggling again, right? So now it's more about like, okay, can he take more of like the extreme pitches? You know what I mean? Can he just take just a little bit more, not a ton more, like can he hone? Because this is where I'm going with this too, is like for the advanced guy, okay, what you're trying to do is you're trying to hone the attractor state. You're trying to widen it in some ways to be able to better fit like, say, for example, I'm just going back to like, because we're talking about landscapes and like, okay, we're trying to widen the highway to handle the traffic that's now going through there. We don't want bottlenecks. And so like, we're not necessarily trying to change everything. We're trying to make the attractor state wider so that it's more flexible. It can handle more situations. And so that's where, going back to what you described of like, this is how we begin to think about practice, is not repeating. I wanted to throw this in. This I think is now relevant here. Okay, Bernstein's quote. Talking about the difference here. His quote is talking about the difference between, trying to perfect a technique or whatever by repetition and repeating that technique, versus, as he'll give kind of the counter here. So, the process of practice towards the achievement of a new motor habit essentially consists in the gradual success of a search for optimal motor solutions to the appropriate problems. Because of this, practice, when properly undertaken, does not consist in repeating the means of solution of a motor problem time after time, but in the process of solving this problem again and again by techniques which we change and perfect from repetition to repetition. So, Bernstein here, he is kind of a pre-EcoD person. Like he kind of laid the foundation for it. So I wouldn't necessarily use all the language here, but to kind of pull from here is like the difference between what it is that we often try to do is we try to like do the same thing over and over again. But instead, practice when properly undertaken doesn't consist in repeating the means of the solution, right? Is doing it the same way over and over again, but in the process of like solving different problems. Okay, taking the solution that you've used and now applying it to different problems and like seeing, okay, when I get into, because I think about this from like the standpoint of like being a Minnesota driver that drives in all sorts of different winter conditions, right? Mm-hmm. My ability to handle the car and know what I'm feeling and how to, maybe quote unquote, break the rules a little bit when I'm driving to understand like, well, that's what fits this situation. Holding to a rigid way of driving is actually going to lead to me losing control of my car, right? So similarly, right, yep. Understanding like the slight nuances of what you do and how to do it and when to do it is what, like, for example, Javi Baez needs to do to like up his game. It's like, it's going to be like these small little insights that he's going to have as far as intentions. And was it a quote that you had maybe said earlier? I'm trying to think this is reminding me of something maybe that we had talked about at another time, but
I think I would
go ahead, jump in.
The car example, I really like that because just the other day I was driving down the road and I was going down the stable Attractor state of going to work, but we had a flat tire. And so my wife needed me to drop her off, and she had told me, she had given me the information. I clearly had it. The coach had instructed me I needed to turn at this right place, but I didn't because, I had this stable. And so I slammed on the brakes and like I almost slid and like hit a school bus. And, but it was like such a good example of like when you do the same thing over and over in the same exact environment, and the car driving is such a perfect example. You're not getting better. You're getting worse. I was not able to change in that moment. And I felt totally out of control because I hadn't been put in that situation. So I love that example because especially when we start to I think it's important to go out of the out of the sports space and then right back into it to better understand how these things apply. And the other piece I would highlight, I think I alluded to this earlier, but I just think that, and you talked a little bit about the data and getting lost in the forest for the trees. And I think the thing that sometimes is frustrating to me is it's like, well, here's this really elite performer who has this once in a generation pitch or this once in a generation skill. And we're going to use them to say that everybody else should just always do the one thing that they're good at all the time. Like this guy throws 80% sliders and is the best closer in the bigs. And it's like, yeah, but like, is that the person in front of you, right? Like that's part of dynamical systems theory, that everybody's kind of on their own nonlinear journey. So just to take that and apply, well, that worked for this guy, so it must work for everybody. I remember doing that as a coach in the beginning of my career. I figured out this cue that helped this guy with a breaking ball. I'm going to do it with everybody. Why is it not working? Well, duh, you idiot. It's not the same. And so I think we also just got to be careful of, not allowing that to overtake us as well, right? The idea of, well, this one really elite guy at the MLB does it, and so that must be the best way to do it. It's like, no, the person in front of you is the best way, and you have to search and explore with them as opposed to, that one stable solution. And not to mention, we don't really know, why is that guy with that slider? He probably is very attuned and adaptable to when he needs a little bit more horizontal break, a little bit more depth, where he needs to start it with different hitters, and that's not super evident to us initially as well.
Right. And I think going back to, the learning the nuances element of it, I think that leads in nicely into talking about like what we're kind of trying to contrast this all with, metastability. Like, and so as we get to like, what is metastability? So one of the things that like I think Rob Gray kind of talks about is like metastability is like keeping your options open. So you have multiple functional attractors that work for different situations, but you're able to stay in a space in between those, and that you're able to switch once the information is there and go based upon what the information is showing you. And so I think that's that's really applicable to like hitters, for example, like maybe how you load or how you work your way into front foot landing or whatever, like that can create multi stability for you and be able to shift into what the situation is putting forward and going with a functional attractor. There's an interesting thing here because this graphic here shows like multi-stability versus bi-stability. And bi-stability kind of to me is where as the situation unfolds, it kind of pushes you. You basically you can only go one way or the other. It's kind of a black and white. Whereas multi-stability allows you the freedom to sit in the middle and then move to where you want to versus the situation kind of pushing you one way or the other.
And I'd like to harp on this over and over. This can be, and this is a little too narrow of what the ecological literature would mean when they're talking about within skill variability and between skill variability. I want to acknowledge that, but also like this is what we do. We take these concepts and we try to apply them better to our sports. I just want to keep hammering home. When we're talking about multi-stability, we might be talking about like between pitches, right? We might be, the hitting side could be maybe facing between pitches, like being able to hit different pitches in the same way to get the same outcome, the functional outcome we want. But it can also be within that pitch as well, like the ability to know, yes, this is my best pitch and I can do different things with it. Or this is how I can do damage on a certain pitch and I can do different things with it based on how the pitcher subtly changes. Does he throw it up, in? Where's the defensive alignment? What's the umpire calling that day? How am I feeling that day? So I just want to continue to underscore that we're not saying when we say multi-stability, because this is what I initially heard all the time. And this is the criticisms I always hear all the time. Oh, so you're saying we just have to do way different things? No, not necessarily. Sometimes we just need to know how to create a little bit more run to bust a barrel on a righty matchup. And sometimes I just really need a grounder. So you got to know how to also make it sink. That's being able to hold two stable regions instead of like, I only know how to throw one fastball. And if that's not working, then I guess I'm just not good that day. No, that's not what we're talking about.
Yeah. And so kind of how I think about metastability when we're talking about like hitting is potentially like how you load, right? Can your load allow you more time to see the ball to be able to adjust? Or when, you go into, when your front foot gets down, do you have a way to also create, to still read the pitch and still make an adjustment once your front foot gets down? Or do you automatically go and execute your attractor state? Do you have multiple attractor states that you can move from that? Because what you see in the multi-stability image here, it's kind of like a W, except within the middle of the W, there's another little shallower attractor well.
Yeah.
And that shallower attractor well is kind of where it's the reason why you want it to be kind of shallower, but still kind of have some depth to it is so that is also a stable attractor, but not so stable that you get stuck there. Right. Yep. And so going back to, practically.
Can I jump in really quick with your hitting? Just like a kind of a proud dad moment. My daughter was hitting the other day and we've just been working so much on like the load. Cause I don't know, like so many young kids, they just step with the front foot. They don't create any like backside tension or load whatsoever. And so I was trying to, last few weeks when we've been hitting with her team or individually, been trying to do different things that cause them to like start to be balanced on that foot, just various things that kind of constrain the activity. And in the game the other day, she was doing like, she would be wide and then her feet would kind of float together and then float ahead. And like, you could clearly see that she was on that back leg floating. And it was a totally proud dad moment because it was like, yeah, that's like everybody else is just stepping and swinging. And if their timing is good, great. But it's like, that's what I'm trying to create. I'm not trying to create necessarily a functional solution so that she can hit a ball as a third grader. And it doesn't even really matter if she's good right now. I don't care. What I care is that if she wants to do this thing long term, that she has this, to your point, this ability to load in different ways. Well, now if the pitcher throws it really hard, like she isn't like committed out on her front foot. She's like kind of got this floating. So it was just super cool to see that start to emerge in the game, because again, that's the youth part of it. It's like we are trying to think downstream to what might give them more options down the road, similar to what you're saying, what metastability might be for a hitter.
And so I think now this kind of goes, we can kind of dive more into the practical, which we've kind of already sprinkled throughout, but like hopefully now it starts to make more sense why we wanted to have more variability within our practice environment. Mm-hmm. I do think, as you're starting to talk about like younger athletes, you may want to only sprinkle that in less frequently. Like it's still there, but like the extremeness of it, you maybe want more subtle. And then, because I think there's a level of, in order for the athlete to stay engaged, especially at a younger level, you may need to have a little bit more success in there. And so this is where, for example, like with the boys, I'm doing more underhand because it's like, okay, really right now, what I want them to figure out is just how to hit the ball. And so like maybe changing the speed and the angle, because what I'm realizing too is like, and I've seen this with shorter hitters because we have one on our team, man, their swing is their barrel is above their hands a lot. And if you think about it, the reason is because if I always throw overhand to my son because he's so short, the ball tends to stay up in the zone. So therefore, the functional solution that he's going to develop in the attractor state he's going to develop is barrel above his hands to a chopping motion, because that's going to work better at a pitch that he sees up in the zone, right? So if I go underhand, I'm going to be able to put it more lower in the zone or more where his torso is, the middle of his torso and belt, right? And so that's going to allow for kind of the traditional where the barrel, you have more of a traditional VBA, a vertical bat angle, cool. Going in. So like you have to begin to think about these things. And this is where like the attractor states kind of come in of like, but he also should still have that flexibility to also potentially, like that is a functional solution for ball above the ball that's up in the zone. So again, this is where you want to mix things up a little bit. And as an athlete, because this goes back to, okay, I want to hone my skill. Well, in order to hone my skill, I need to explore more. So I can have a better understanding and I can get a deeper understanding of how I need to approach, maybe refine my intentions, become more attuned to the information in the environment, become more attuned to how I'm moving and how I need to move in relationship to the ball, all these sort of things. And you only get that when your practice environment has enough variability in it. So like, let's use an example with like Javi Baez, right? You may want pitches that are around the zone more, and for him to start to figure out like, okay, based upon the situation, give him different situations or whatever, or just explore, okay, what happens if we go, I want you to swing at everything this round. Okay, now I only want you to swing at balls that I think you can drive to the gaps, or balls that you think you can hit out, or shift it to like, you know what, on this round, I only want you to swing at balls that I think that you can hit it to the holes in the infield, or like hit it through the infield or whatever, right? And so you start to have him be a little bit more, to have to make some more decisions. And so like he can take pitches, or create some sort of way of like, get creative with how you're thinking about like, okay, when do you want to swing here? For example, maybe we'll start with a count. To incentivize them like, okay, you're close to a walk at this point. You know what I mean? Or like you swung at that pitch and it was way out of the zone. So if I come back to that later in the at bat, can you lay off of that pitch? Right. Yeah. So like trying to put in these different ways for him to experience different things so that he can kind of work on his weaknesses a little bit, but you still leave the strengths in there for him to kind of like try to refine his approach at the plate and try to dial in, okay, what is he trying to focus on, or what can he become more sensitive to within the environment?
Yeah. 2 examples from me to get practical as we start to wrap up here. Like you said, like one, both within the pitching world for me. My daughter's been playing fall softball, and we have these nights where we rotate, and one of the stations is softball pitching, which I know nothing about, which is like bad in some ways, but also has been kind of good to allow me to just watch some people who seem to move well. And 2 things that have helped her and just kind of clicked a little bit. I'll give the bad example first, and then I'll give the 2 good examples. Amidst trying to work with her, we had some success, but in the middle of it, we'd go and they'd have us do all the drills that everybody does, like wrist flips, and then stop at a certain point. And I remember like initially, and I want to be careful because maybe those things are useful. I don't know. Maybe if she does them more, they'll pay some dividends. I'm not really sure. But initially what I noticed is like how hard it was for her to pitch at the end of all those drills, right? So we're doing almost like this stacking of skills, like you're going to start at the end and then you're going to do a little bit more of the delivery and then a little bit more, and you're going to almost like chunk it together from small pieces. And then she would get to pitch and she would be all over the joint and she like couldn't figure it out. When we've been working together, I asked her one time to like, hey, I've seen like girls do weird things with their hips. Like, and I'd show her a couple videos on Twitter. Like, I don't know what they're doing, but it seems like they're turning their hips and doing something. And then she'd like sit there and play with it. And I go, why don't we just try it? And then she kind of found her own thing and all of a sudden was throwing more on the line and dotting it a little bit better. The other thing is like, when we don't really do a whole lot of drills beforehand. I just go, let's start pitching. Right. And so she just starts pitching to me. And as soon as she starts to like be around, and even honestly, sometimes when she's struggling, I'll just move around. I'll get in front of the plate. I'll go farther behind. I'll move my target to the right, to the left in places that she'll never be asked to throw a pitch. And then I'll go back normal and she'll seem to stabilize and throw a little bit more strikes to me. We'll put her sister in to just stand in and swing and be a batter right away once she throws a few. And so I've seen some success with, rather than like this idea of like chunking and doing things, I've just seen some success with just like doing the thing and then helping her explore around. Like, I'm not really sure what the hips are doing, or hey, why don't you try to hit this target over here? We're keeping some of the main parts of what she will do when she actually has to pitch in the game there. And it seems to, at least in the short run, she's finding more functional solutions to throw it over the plate, as opposed to when she does all these things that don't really look like it. And then she does that at the end. Sometimes she seems to struggle a little bit more. So that's one that I would say on the youth side, like there's not a ton of variability there. Like she's doing the same thing. It's just a small focus of attention or a small target change. For my players, one of the things we've done a lot with pitch design is we'll take the same pitch, and once they feel like they have ooh, I do like this grip. It seems like it gives me I have the cue and the grip and it gives me the movement I'm looking for, and I've thrown it in the game. It looks good. We'll start to just manipulate. Oh, can you make that slider go this way a little bit more or straight down a little bit more? And I actually sort of lucked into this last year. We had a young man who was a 6th year senior, was just like super, super skilled, really good feel for manipulating the ball in different ways. And we're like 1 session, 2 sessions into it, just looking at his sinker session as I'm like learning all these new pitchers. And it's like, it's a really good pitch. There's nothing I can do to improve that in its current form. And so I just said, would you like try to explore trying to figure out how you can make it go straight down and straight sideways, as well as what you currently do, which is a little bit of both? And he's like, oh yeah, sure. And like 2 sessions later, sure enough, he started to learn how his thumb manipulation helped him, how a different seam shift allowed him to get more sync. And I sort of lucked into it just because I was on that early side of the ecological thing, just going like, well, you already have a pretty good stable solution. Can we just figure out how to make it do different things? And then he would just employ that. No, I need a ground ball, or I need to saw off a barrel, or I'm just going to stick with what's really good because it's rolling tonight. And so those are a couple of examples of ways that I've tried to help people move between attractor states, both from the youth sphere of maybe not having as much variability, and even on the more skilled, where it's really detailed, but it's connecting them to why might you use this, and under what circumstances and situations would you use this new way that you can make a pitch move.
Right. And so I think to go off of what you were saying with your daughter's practice and chunking it, right? You have to remember that like when you chunk the skill, there's some exploration that's going on that kind of has a little bit of carryover. Because like when I started doing like the rope stuff, one of the movements I had to kind of slow it down because what I was doing, that like how I was understanding is I needed to explore that part just to get an idea of like, okay, how do I move my body? Because like when I'm just watching it, like I can't quite necessarily always like just pick it up right away, because otherwise it's just too chaotic, right? So sometimes it does.
I could see this working with like when she has to learn like a pitch, and she has to like manipulate. I could see it being like, yeah, why don't we just start with like some flips and you just try to figure out how's that feel? Oh, okay, now let's go do it in the real thing. I could totally see it. I do wonder if those things are super useful before you found a problem. Like you found, I'm struggling with this place. I'm going to explore around there. It's like, I think what we do with kids is it's like, no, we have to do all these steps in order for them to get there. I'm like, yeah, but they haven't displayed any problems in those steps. So why are we exploring there when just do the thing, see what emerges, and then go explore, like you said with the rope.
Well, so here's on that point. Okay. So here's the opposite, and this is what in order to get that technique down though, that first I had to slow it down.
Yep.
What eventually allowed me to get it though was I had to watch I needed at least about 3 videos to watch. And then what I did at the end, because I was like, I wasn't doing it chunked, was not leading to it coming together at all. Like when I tried to speed up, it just wasn't working. I couldn't quite figure it out. But what I ended up doing was just watching it. And then, I was just like, I'm just going to mimic him. I'm just going to mimic what I'm seeing, like what you described earlier with, showing your daughter a video of like, hey, just, like kind of look and watch, like maybe try to mimic what she's doing. So that for me worked really well. That's how I eventually got it. Right. But I needed initially the exploration for me to explore the landscape and kind of feel the edges. I need to kind of feel the edges just to kind of get an idea of like how my body's moving through space. Because otherwise I have no spatial awareness of anything that's going on with this whole thing. Right. So I need a little bit of that. But where this ties in is this book, The Inner Game of Tennis, that was really popular in baseball for a while. And I think, should always make a comeback because it's a really good book. He was explaining in it, what's interesting? Young people, right? They'll go hang out with their friends and they'll come back and they'll have learned a new dance that they've never done before. You know how complicated dance is, right? Like the different steps that go into and like the number of degrees of freedom or like, joint actions that you use in those different dance moves. And you have like the whole thing down, after, a night hanging out with your friends. That's kind of, and did they, break it down and like, get a tempo out and like meter it for you. Right. And like teach you all the steps one by one.
For sure.
Right.
Yeah.
And I had this experience because I did dig swing dance for a little bit. And, it did help going to classes and having them slow it down, all that sort of stuff. But what was interesting to me, because I always hated the line dancing, hated it. And I took this one girl on a date and I, for whatever reason, was just like, you know what, this would be fun for you. I don't know it. It just, the freeing moment was like, you don't know what's going on. I don't know what's going on. So let's, because we both don't know, like I can join you in like feeling foolish. And what was weird is like, I was just like kind of joking around and goofing around and oh my gosh, I was actually doing it. I was like, it was the most bizarre thing because I was letting myself like just watch what they were doing and trying to mimic it and like make fun of it. And it goes to show you don't need to like break it down into chunks. And what the inner game of tennis is like kind of talked about is like when you just watch and try to absorb the movement and you try to mimic it, oftentimes you're going to acquire that skill way quicker. Now, whether or not you're doing it exactly like they're doing it doesn't matter, but like the functionality, your ability to functionally interact with the environment when you do that is significantly higher. And if you use that as your starting place to develop your attractor state and your attractor well, that puts you in a lot better position because it's more transferable versus you doing it in a chunked fashion. So going back to what we've talked about before of like, there is a role for chunking a little bit, but that's in the very early stages. And like we kind of talked about maybe at the beginning was like, we want to move away from that as quickly as possible per se, because that's not, the longer you stay there and develop that attractor well, that's not going to go with you, And so it's kind of the same thing with lifting. Like how much time do I spend teaching them a highly technical lift? And getting them really good at that lift when it's like, that's not what their sport is. Their sport is not getting really good at weightlifting. So like maybe it's better that I spend my time on other lifts, developing the same qualities with something else. Right. And so like, to me, that's kind of the same thing here is like, the more you go, and this is what I was kind of going with why I brought this back up, right? You're building your own attractor well for this thing, and it's not necessarily related to, and it's further away. So like, you're not going to see that transfer. Right. And then more often than not, when you get to that last thing, because of recency bias, and there may be some other psychological term, right? Because your mind is still over there, it's going to have a harder time switching to this other thing. So when you come back to it, you may actually be struggling even more. It may put your system in an even harder state to actually be attuned to what's going on in the environment, right? So like, this is where, again, trying to have information present that we're interacting with and really respecting the performer environment relationship, because this may be getting too long-winded here, but there's also a relationship between, your internal state, right? Relationship between you and your body. right? Getting to know your body and how your body moves through space and maybe manipulates and interacts with the ball or whatever it is, like there's some value in understanding how to relate to your own body. But at the same point, the end goal is to be able to understand how your body relates, you and your body, and how you manipulate that also interacts with the environment and the task that you're trying to do. And you can see with the dance example, you can start there. And that's what the inner game of tennis, honestly, like if you go read that book, it's not a book that's like there to tell you about ecological dynamics. But what it posits is it's actually better to start with trying to do the whole movement and trying to incorporate and interact with the task right at the beginning is oftentimes more effective. So
no, that's your book recommendation. I think the one that ties in really well here that you alluded to, from Dynamics of Skill Acquisition, right? Skills are more likely to be retained if they are originally acquired across a range of constraints. The essence of transfer is being able to adapt an existing motor pattern to a different set of ecological constraints. And that's what you're acknowledging. Constraints shape the information you connect to. And so keeping the information performer environment relationship, the information movement coupling, like keeping that there is so important. And then changing across constraints actually earlier. It doesn't have to be crazy. It doesn't have to be wildly different. But just try not to, same thing, same environment, same, right? We intuitively know there's always going to be variability. You've pointed that out, and I think that's important to acknowledge. But if the only thing that's ever changing is like how I'm feeling that day, but I'm trying to keep everything else exactly the same, the technique, it's just not going to be as robust of a skill and as adaptable.
Right. And then you're only going to be able to perform when everything is feeling right. Precisely. And that's where... Precisely. Going back to the goal here is to become dexterous. And we didn't necessarily define it, but basically it's like, okay, across a wide range of situations, can you effectively, efficiently, quickly find a solution for that? That shows mastery or dexterity. And so how you practice dictates, how well you're going to get to that place. Because if you want to master being able to execute your optimal movement every single time, then, okay, that's great when the conditions are optimal for that optimal swing. But since that's not the situation that the environment that we train in, our training should allow for that, to allow for adaptability. And so you should again try to constrain to afford. Okay. Pick task environments and task constraints that are going to afford a multitude of solutions to emerge. And so to me, that to me is what I'd kind of try to land the plane on is like, practically when we're going, like, what is your intention when you're setting up your practice environments? Is it just to perfect a certain move, or is it to explore and understand how that move relates to the problem? Mm-hmm. And how can you create adaptability, or how can you understand that relationship better? And so to me, if you're doing that, I think you're going to set yourself up to have the fundamentals, which is really the being attuned to the higher order variables. And so to me, that's and learning the lawful relationship between how we move and how we interact and what information we need to connect to. And so that would be kind of the thing that I would leave people with. How about you? What takeaways do you want people to have from this?
I think you highlighted that well. I'll give almost like an encouragement, because it's we want to do what we're asking the athletes to do. And I'll give kind of a silly example here, but I was trying to figure out during we call it gameplay rather than scrimmage. We set up small slices of the game, different counts and whatnot, and we give different amount of points based on what the pitcher and the hitter does. The problem is sometimes I've noticed is that the pitcher or the hitter, but especially our pitchers, they don't know necessarily in the thick of the game what like, did they score? Did they just beat the hitter? Did they accomplish the goal that we're trying to create more with? That's the whole goal, and they get more points if they do it. Well, did I just win that at bat or lose that at bat? And so the first time I brought a whiteboard out, was trying to and I acknowledged, guys, I think it's going to be a bad idea, and I think it's going to be terrible. And it was. Like, we wrote too small. You couldn't see the points. It wasn't useful at all. And so But through that initial bad idea exploration, we figured out, no, it just needs to be at bat to at bat. And so now we write in one, and it's kind of a crappy job. The guy has to sit there and be really on cue. And then he writes the end of that bat and he holds it up, and we get immediate feedback. And I've noticed our guys, it's just like each time, like, hey, you just lost 0 to negative or 0 to positive 3 there. The next one, it's like, hey, 3 to 2, you won that at bat. Do it again, stack this win. And it seems like they're a little bit more present. And so why I tell that story is just to say, like, I had to try, and that's what I told our player. I said, we have to try a bad plan first, and we have to fail, and then we'll get something better. But we can't just keep, well, at some point we'll think of a good idea. No, we won't, not unless we try something. And so when you're trying to constrain to a forward, you'll probably constrain to a constrain. You'll probably do it wrong, and that's okay. That's the purpose of learning is that exploration process. And it's not just for our players, it's for us as coaches too. And I think it's just important to keep that in mind, that just try stuff. And like, what's the worst that's going to happen? That's going to look really bad. Yeah. Now, and now your players are probably going to give you feedback. Oh, how could we improve this? That's been a super powerful, freeing thing for me is if skill indeed isn't just living in the brain, I'm not messing them up. If I mess that up, I'm actually just giving them a new problem to solve. And maybe it was a bad problem, and maybe it was totally the wrong thing to do, but it does help me learn, and it helps them learn, and we can do it better next time without worrying. That's like, oh no, I put a movement in their brain that we have to break that habit. It's like, no, that's not how it works. So,
and to that point, like it loops back to what we were saying before of repetition is the soil in which spontaneity is birthed, or creativity, right? And so like, this is where the ingenuity happens of like, okay, we're coming back to the same problem again, or the same like task. Maybe not be the exact same problem, but like we're coming back with the same intention, and it's slightly different. And through the interaction in that, and the failure and all that sort of stuff is where you're going to begin to start to learn and hone a better solution, a more functional solution. And so, I actually, what's changed with me with regards to this and what I want to leave people with is repetition is not bad per se. Mm-hmm. But what is bad is having a fixed response to that repetition and trying to force something over and over again instead of trying to be adapting to the repetition and working towards our end goal, And so like, to me, that's, like back to what you're saying of like, okay, we want to figure out how do we get better at whiff, right? And so coming back to exploring that same spot in the landscape, in that motor landscape, we're exploring it, we're getting more connected to that, we're better understanding it. And through that, we become more creative. There's more ingenuity there and coming up with better and better solutions. So
Yep. I'll finish with, I like your example there. We had a young man, I use it in our recruiting presentation to explain how we train differently. He wanted to throw a command pen, dotting like crazy. So we moved the catcher like in places he'd never be. Right-handed batter's box, 10 feet behind, in front. Dots. I move now the catcher and him on the mound. Dots. I add weighted balls. So now we have 3 variables changing every single time. Where the catcher is, and it's in places that he'd never be, where he's at on the mound, and that he's using a different weighted ball. And he started to fail just a little bit. And I was like, perfect. Now we're there. Now we're at that edge of what you said. Repetition's not bad. Yeah, let's go. Hit the spot every time. But repetition, had he just thrown 25 straight pitches and just hit, like he would have walked off the field, no better. In fact, he probably would have been worse because he was just been practicing the same thing over and over. And so that's what it made me think of when you said the piece about repetition there. Like, I'm just trying to make it a little bit more challenging, a little bit more variable on him, so he has to learn to adapt to a different problem.
Right. And with that, he begins to learn, hopefully, a little bit more about himself. Right. If the ball gets a little waterlogged, a little wet, right. Yep. And there's a whole
fatigued, it feels a little heavier.
Right. Yep. Or like, there's just this Twitter thread that I retweeted where one coach was talking about, the perception of the backstop. Right. And you get to a field where like the perception just feels off. Right. So like all those things. And so to me, though, to just kind of reiterate, like what you just described there was repetition without repetition. Right. Mm-hmm. And so, but going back to what I've maybe said before about like, self-organization, it's always present. Constraints are always present. So is rep without rep. And so to understand, how we can have and utilize and really work with rep without rep versus against it, right? If you're trying to do rote repetition, you're working against rep without rep instead of working with it. And so to me, that's kind of the encouragement here. So
that's great.
Do you have anything else? Otherwise, we'll land it right there.
It's a great place. I love that piece. Don't work against rep without rep. It's there. Just embrace it.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, hope you guys enjoyed today's podcast. Until next time.